Sometimes the heart knows what the mind can't understand. When grief sits heavy on a man's shoulders, he'll reach for anything that might bring back what he's lost. Jedediah Cole was the richest man in the valley, but money couldn't fill the empty chair at his dinner table. So when he saw that broken-down paint mare at the auction limping, ribs showing, spirit nearly gone, something stirred in his chest. Everyone laughed when he paid good money for a horse that should have been put down. But this wasn't just any horse. Her name was Daisy, and she'd belonged to his grandson. The boy, everyone said, died in the war. When Jed started caring for that mare, he found something hidden in her saddle blanket that would turn his world upside down. What secret had his family been keeping from him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lazy sea ranch as Jedediah Cole stood on his wraparound porch, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands. At 68, he cut an impressive figure, silver hair combed neat, shoulders still broad beneath his pressed white shirt, boots polished to a mirror shine. The 10,000-acre spread stretched before him like a green ocean, dotted with prime Angus cattle and bordered by the kind of rolling hills that made city folks pay good money just to look at postcards. But all that wealth couldn't chase away the silence that filled his days. The great house behind him stood as testimony to 3 generations of Cole prosperity. Built by his grandfather in 1887, expanded by his father, and perfected by Jed himself, it boasted 12 rooms, hand-carved oak trim, and enough space to house a small army. These days, it felt more like a museum than a home. His footsteps echoed in empty hallways, where children's laughter once rang out. The dining room table, built to seat 16, hadn't seen more than one place setting in 3 years. On the mantelpiece in his study sat the artifact that haunted his quiet moments, a family portrait in a silver frame, now dusty despite the housekeeper's weekly attention. 3 generations of Cole men stared back at him, his own weathered face, his son Robert's stern expression, and between them the bright eyes of his grandson Tommy. The boy had been 19 when that picture was taken, home on leave from basic training, chest puffed with pride and dreams of serving his country. Jed's finger had traced that young face so many times that the glass bore a permanent smudge over Tommy's cheek. "Mornin', Mr. Cole." Miguel Hernandez approached from the stable, hat in hand. At 45, the ranch foreman had worked the lazy sea for over 20 years, arriving as a green kid who barely spoke English and growing into the most trusted man on the property. His wife, Maria, kept house for Jed, their 3 children treating the old rancher like a beloved grandfather, the only grandchildren Jed had left to spoil. "Miguel." Jed nodded, grateful for the interruption to his brooding. "How are the mares doing?" "Good, good. That new filly is coming along real nice. Should make a fine cutting horse." Miguel's English still carried the soft accent of his Sonoran childhood, but his knowledge of horses was second to none. "You want me to get Buck saddled for your morning ride?" Jed shook his head. Buck, his prize Palomino stallion, stood 16 hands high and moved like liquid gold across the range. Beautiful, expensive, perfect, everything Jed had once taken pride in owning. Not today. Got business in town. "Auction day," Miguel said, understanding immediately. Every first Saturday of the month, Jed drove to Millbrook's livestock auction, though he rarely bought anything anymore. It had become habit, more than necessity, a way to fill the long hours that stretched between dawn and dusk. The drive to town took 30 minutes along county roads that wound through ranches almost as prosperous as his own. Millbrook had grown from a dusty cattle town into something approaching civilization over the past 50 years, but it maintained the rhythm of agricultural life. Saturday mornings brought ranchers, farmers, and horse traders from 3 counties to bid on everything from breeding bulls to broken-down plow horses. The auction barn buzzed with familiar voices as Jed took his usual seat in the front section. Harold Whimsy, who owned the spread adjacent to the lazy sea, waved from across the aisle. "Jed, you finally gonna buy something today, or just keep us honest with your presence?" Jed managed a smile. "Just watching the market, Harold, same as always." But that wasn't entirely true. Something had drawn him here beyond habit. Call it instinct, or maybe just the stubborn hope that still flickered in his chest after 3 years of grief. Something told him today would be different. The auctioneer, a rail-thin man named Bucky Thompson, who'd been calling bids since before Jed's own father was born, worked through the morning's lots with practiced efficiency. Prize bulls sold for 5 figures. Breeding mares commanded respect and serious money. Working horses found homes with men who valued function over form. Then they brought out lot number 37. The paint mare shuffled into the ring on 3 good legs, her 4th barely touching the ground. Her coat, once probably beautiful black and white, had faded to dull grey and cream. Ribs showed through dull hair that hadn't seen a proper brushing in months. But it was her eyes that stopped Jed's breath in his throat, dark, intelligent, filled with a dignity that suffering hadn't quite broken. "Now here we got ourselves a project," Bucky called out, his voice carrying the artificial cheerfulness of a man trying to move questionable merchandise. "Paint mare, approximately 12 years old, needs some attention, but comes with a good bloodline. Make a fine companion horse for somebody with patience." The barn fell quiet. This wasn't the kind of animal that drew serious bidders. A few local kids might want a cheap horse to trail ride, but the mare's condition suggested expensive veterinary bills with no guarantee of success. "Do I hear $50? Bucky's voice echoed in the silence. Jed felt something tighten in his chest. There was something about the way the mare held her head, the shape of her ears, the precise white marking that ran from her forehead to her muzzle. He'd seen that marking before, in photographs his grandson had sent from overseas. $50, he heard himself say, his voice carrying clearly through the barn. A murmur ran through the crowd. Jedediah Cole didn't buy broken-down horses. He bought champions, animals that reflected his status and success. This was as out of character as the richest man in the valley shopping for groceries at a discount store. "60, called a voice from the back, probably some kid thinking he could flip the horse for profit. 200, Jed said calmly. The murmur became open conversation. Harold Whimsy turned in his seat, eyebrows raised in question. Other ranchers craned their necks to get a better look at what Jed saw that they'd missed. 250. The kid in the back wasn't giving up easy. 500. Jed's voice cut through the chatter like a blade. This time, the silence was complete. $500 for a horse that might need to be put down was beyond eccentric, it bordered on foolish. The kid in the back slouched in his seat, shaking his head. "Sold to Mr. Cole for $500. Bucky's gavel came down with a sharp crack. As Jed made his way to the office to settle payment, the whispers followed him. Lost his mind. Grief makes men do strange things. More money than sense. He'd heard it all before, in different contexts. The town had been talking about Jedediah Cole ever since his wife Margaret passed 4 years ago, and the gossip had only intensified after Tommy's death. The truth was simpler and more complicated than their speculation. Margaret Cole had been the heart of everything good in Jed's life. She'd softened his hard edges, reminded him that wealth meant nothing without people to share it with, and filled their home with laughter and warmth. Her battle with cancer had been brief but brutal, and her absence left a hole that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. His son Robert had tried to help in his awkward way. A successful attorney in Denver, Robert possessed all his father's business acumen, but none of his mother's warmth. Their relationship had always been cordial but distant, too much alike in their stubborn pride to ever truly understand each other. Robert's own marriage had ended in divorce, leaving him focused entirely on his career and ill-equipped to offer comfort to a grieving father. But Tommy had been different. The boy had inherited his grandmother's gift for connection, her ability to find joy in simple moments. His letters from basic training and later from deployment had been bright spots in Jed's darkening world. Tommy wrote about the horses he'd worked with in the cavalry unit, the friends he'd made, the pride he felt in serving his country. The last letter had arrived 3 years ago, just 2 weeks before the notification from the Department of Defense. Killed in action, they'd said, improvised explosive device, no remains recovered, Purple Heart awarded posthumously, a folded flag and the sympathies of a grateful nation. Jed had memorized every word of that final letter. Tommy had written about a paint mare named Daisy that had become his favorite mount, describing her intelligence and loyalty with the same affection he'd once reserved for the farm dogs. "She's got the prettiest white blaze down her face, Grandpa, and the sweetest disposition you ever saw. Reminds me of Grandmother's old mare, the one she taught me to ride on." Looking at the broken horse in the auction ring, Jed had seen that same distinctive marking, that same intelligent gaze. It couldn't be coincidence. Not when grief had taught him that the world held fewer coincidences than most people imagined, and that sometimes the heart recognized truth before the mind could accept it. As he loaded the mare into his trailer, gentle hands guiding her up the ramp while she favored her injured leg, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not quite hope, but not despair either. Something in between, fragile as new grass, but stubborn enough to push through hard ground. The drive home passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the soft sounds of the mare shifting her weight behind him. Miguel was waiting when the trailer pulled into the ranch yard, his weathered face creased with curiosity, but wise enough not to ask too many questions. "Want me to put her in the south pasture?" Miguel asked, eyeing the mare's condition with professional assessment. "No," Jed said, surprising himself with the decisiveness in his voice. "Put her in the paddock next to the barn. She'll need close attention for a while." As they unloaded the mare and settled her into the small paddock with fresh water and good hay, Jed found himself studying her markings, her movements, the way she tested her injured leg. She was thin, tired, and hurt, but there was something unbroken in her spirit that reminded him of someone he'd lost. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the range and the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Jed stood at the paddock fence, watching the mare eat. She'd already gained some alertness, her ears pricking forward when she heard his footsteps, her dark eyes tracking his movements with what might have been recognition. Tomorrow he'd call Doc Peterson, the best large animal veterinarian in 3 counties. They'd x-ray that leg, run blood tests, develop a treatment plan. It would cost more than the horse was worth by any practical measure, but Jed had learned that practical measures didn't always account for what mattered most. The family portrait still sat on his mantelpiece, gathering dust in the empty house behind him. But for the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel quite so complete. There was purpose in the air, a sense that something long lost might yet be found. The mare lifted her head from the hay and looked directly at him, and Jed could have sworn he saw something familiar in those dark eyes, something that reminded him of a boy who'd once written letters about a paint horse named Daisy, and the promise that some bonds transcend even death itself. Doc Peterson arrived at the Lazy Sea just after dawn on Monday morning, his veterinary truck loaded with equipment and 30 years of experience treating everything from prize bulls to backyard chickens. He was a lean man in his 60s, hands steady as a surgeon's, with the kind of quiet competence that came from a lifetime of healing animals. "Well, Jed," he said, climbing out of his truck and adjusting his worn leather bag. Miguel called and said, "You bought yourself a project horse. Can't say I'm surprised. You always did have a soft spot for the ones that needed help." But that wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it. Jed's reputation was built on acquiring the finest horseflesh money could buy. His stable was home to champions, not charity cases. This morning's call had surprised Doc Peterson as much as the auction purchase had surprised everyone in Millbrook. They found the mare standing in the paddock, alert but cautious. In the clear morning light, her condition was even more apparent. The prominent ribs, the dull coat, the way she held her left rear hoof just off the ground. But there was something else, something that hadn't been visible in the dim auction barn. "What do you make of those marks?" Jed asked, pointing to faint scars along the mare's flanks and shoulders. Doc Peterson approached slowly, speaking in the low, soothing tones that settled nervous animals. The mare allowed him to run his hands along her neck, down her legs, across her barrel. His examination was thorough and methodical, the kind of assessment that revealed as much about an animal's history as its current condition. "These aren't accident scars," he said after several minutes, his voice thoughtful. "See how they're positioned? That's consistent with wounds from shrapnel or debris. And this one here," he indicated a long, faded mark along her left shoulder. "That's surgical. Someone did some serious repair work on this girl." Jed felt his chest tighten. Military? Could be. The precision of the surgical work suggests it was done by someone with real skill, not just a country vet patching up a ranch horse. "And these other marks," Doc Peterson continued his examination, his experienced hands reading the mare's body like a book written in scars and old injuries. "She's been through some kind of trauma, something violent." The veterinarian report would become an artifact that changed everything, though at the moment it was just professional observation from a man who'd seen plenty of animals bear the marks of human conflict. Doc Peterson had treated horses injured in ranch accidents, cattle hurt in transport, working animals that carried the evidence of hard lives. But this was different. "There's something else," Doc said, lifting the mare's injured hoof for a closer look. "This isn't a recent injury. It's old, healed wrong, probably never got proper treatment when it happened. But look at this." He indicated small, perfectly round scars on the mare's hooves. "Those are nail holes. This horse has worn military shoes, the kind they use in combat zones. Special steel, designed to handle rough terrain and long marches." Jed's mind raced back to Tommy's letters, to descriptions of cavalry units working in Afghanistan's mountainous regions, of horses that carried soldiers through terrain where vehicles couldn't go. The boy had written about the special bond between riders and their mounts, about how a horse could mean the difference between life and death in hostile territory. "How old would you say she is?" Jed asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. 12, maybe 13. Prime working age for a military mount." Doc Peterson straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth. "The question is, how did she end up in a livestock auction in Montana?" That question would haunt Jed for the rest of the day. As Doc Peterson continued his examination, taking x-rays that revealed old fractures in the injured leg, drawing blood samples to check for lingering infections, prescribing a treatment regimen that would require weeks of careful nursing, Jed found himself studying the mare with new eyes. She was watching him too, those dark, intelligent eyes, tracking his movements with what seemed like recognition. When he approached the fence, she limped closer, stretching her neck over the top rail to sniff his hands. Her breath was warm against his palms, and for a moment he was transported back 15 years, to teaching a gap-toothed boy how to read a horse's mood, how to approach with patience and respect. Tommy loved horses, he found himself telling Doc Peterson as they prepared the first round of medications. "From the time he could walk, he was following me to the stable. His grandmother used to say he spoke horse before he spoke English properly." Doc nodded, understanding the weight of grief that colored every memory. He'd known the Cole family for decades, had delivered dozens of foals on their ranch, had been present for celebrations and sorrows alike. Tommy's death had hit the whole community hard. A local boy who'd made good, served his country, paid the ultimate price. "This mare," Doc said carefully, "she's been well trained, military standard. You can see it in how she stands, how she responds to commands. Someone invested serious time and skill in her education." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Military horses were valuable assets, carefully trained and maintained. They didn't simply disappear from service and turn up at rural auctions hundreds of miles from their last known location. There was a story here, a trail of events that had led from some distant battlefield to a Montana paddock. As Doc Peterson loaded his equipment and prepared to leave, he handed Jed the veterinary report that would serve as the first concrete piece of evidence in an investigation neither of them quite realized had begun. "She's got good bone structure under all that wear," he said. "With proper care, she could recover most of her mobility. The leg will always be weak, but she could live comfortably for years yet. The question is whether you're prepared for that kind of commitment." Jed looked at the mare, who had returned to her hay, but kept one ear turned toward their conversation. That evening, after Miguel had helped him administer the first round of medications and settle the mare for the night, Jed sat in his study with the veterinary report spread across his desk. The clinical language couldn't disguise the story written in the mare's scars and old injuries. This was a horse that had served in combat, had survived violence that killed or maimed her human companions, and had somehow found her way to a place where no military horse should ever end up. He pulled out the letter Tommy had written about Daisy, reading it for the 100th time since the boy's death. The description matched perfectly not just the physical markings, but the personality traits Tommy had loved. The mare's intelligence, her gentle disposition despite her hard life, the way she seemed to understand human emotions and respond accordingly. The logical part of Jed's mind recognized how unlikely it was that this broken-down auction horse could be the same animal his grandson had ridden in Afghanistan. Thousands of horses served in military units around the world. Paint markings weren't unique. The odds were astronomical. But grief had taught him that logic didn't always account for the connections that mattered most, and something in the mare's eyes, something in the way she'd approached him at the auction, suggested that impossible things sometimes happened when hearts needed healing most. The veterinary report became his starting point, the first piece of evidence in what would become an investigation that would change his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his grandson's death. But that night, as he finally turned off the study light and made his way upstairs to another lonely bedroom in a house built for family, Jed carried with him the first flicker of something he'd thought was lost forever. Not quite hope, not yet. But the possibility that some stories didn't end where the official reports said they did, and that sometimes the most important truths were written not in government documents, but in the scars carried by those who survived to tell their tales. Outside his window, the mare stood quietly in her paddock, healing slowly under a canopy of Montana stars, carrying secrets that would soon reshape one old man's understanding of love, loss, and the unbreakable bonds that connect the living and the dead. The mare's recovery became Jed's morning ritual. Every dawn found him in the paddock with fresh hay, clean water, and the careful administration of medications Doc Peterson had prescribed. The work was methodical, almost meditative tasks that filled the hollow hours between sunrise and sunset with purpose he hadn't felt in years. It was during the third week of care that Jed made the discovery that would change everything. He was examining the mare's tack more closely, preparing to replace the worn saddle blanket with something more suitable for her healing condition, when his fingers found an irregularity in the old leather. What he'd initially taken for natural wear patterns revealed itself as something else entirely: careful stitching that had been disguised to look like normal repairs. "Miguel," he called to his foreman, who was checking fence posts nearby. "Come take a look at this." The saddle was old military issue, scarred and weathered by hard use, but the stitching along one edge was newer, more precise than the original construction. Someone had opened a seam and sewn it back together with deliberate care, creating a hidden pocket between layers of leather. Working carefully with his pocket knife, Jed opened the concealed compartment. His fingers touched metal before his eyes could process what he was seeing, and when he pulled the objects into the light, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. 2 military dog tags on a chain, dented and stained but still perfectly readable. Thomas Robert Cole. The serial number matched the records Jed had memorized after the notification of death. Blood type, birth date, religion, all the essential information reduced to stamped metal, along with the words that had haunted Jed's dreams for 3 years. But here they were, hidden in a horse's saddle in a Montana paddock, when they should have been buried with his grandson in some distant grave. The emotional impact hit him like a physical blow. Jed's legs gave way, and he found himself sitting heavily in the dirt, the dog tags trembling in his weathered hands. Miguel was beside him instantly, steadying the older man's shoulders while the magnitude of the discovery settled over them both. "Dios mío," Miguel whispered, understanding immediately what they'd found. He'd seen enough war movies, knew enough veterans to recognize dog tags when he saw them. "Mr. Cole, what does this mean?" Jed couldn't answer immediately. The tags were real, the weight of them, the familiar dents and scratches that Tommy had described in his letters. The boy had been proud of those tags, had written about keeping them clean and properly positioned according to military regulations. These weren't replicas or memorial pieces. They were the actual tags that had hung around his grandson's neck during his deployment. "It means," Jed said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "that either Tommy survived long enough to hide these, or someone else did it for him." The implications crashed over him in waves. If Tommy had died in the explosion that destroyed his unit, his tags would have been recovered with his personal effects or remains. The fact that they were here, hidden in his horse's saddle, suggested a different story entirely, one where he'd had time to plan, to leave clues, to hope that someday someone would find them. Miguel helped him to his feet, both men treating the discovery with the reverence it deserved. The mare watched them from across the paddock, her intelligent eyes seeming to understand that something significant had occurred. She limped closer, stretching her neck over the fence as if seeking their attention. "She knew," Jed said, reaching out to stroke the mare's muzzle. "She's been waiting for someone to find them." That evening, Jed sat in his study with the dog tags spread on his desk next to the veterinary report and Tommy's final letters. The chain had been cleaned carefully, revealing the full details stamped into the metal. Everything matched the official records except for one crucial detail. These tags should have been returned to the family along with the flag and Purple Heart. The questions multiplied with each hour of contemplation. Why had Tommy hidden the tags? Had he suspected he was in danger? Was he trying to leave evidence for an investigation? Or was it simpler than that, a young soldier's attempt to leave something of himself with the horse he'd grown to love? Miguel joined him around 8 o'clock, bringing coffee and the practical wisdom that had made him invaluable over the years. He studied the tags with the careful attention of a man who understood that small details sometimes revealed large truths. "My uncle served in Vietnam," Miguel said after a long silence. "He told me stories about soldiers who didn't trust their own command structure. Sometimes they'd leave things with their gear, with their animals, just in case." "In case of what?" "In case they disappeared and someone needed to know the truth." The words hung heavy in the ranch house silence. Outside, the mare whinnied softly, a sound that seemed to carry across the darkness with unusual urgency. Both men looked toward the paddock, where the animal's silhouette was visible against the starlit Montana sky. Jed made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "I need to find out what happened to that unit. The real story, not just what the army told us." Miguel nodded, understanding the magnitude of what his employer was contemplating. "That kind of information, it might be classified. Military doesn't like civilians asking questions about operations that went wrong." "Then we'll start with what isn't classified," Jed said, his voice carrying the quiet determination that had built a ranching empire from scratch. "We'll start with the horse." The next morning brought renewed purpose to the mare's care routine. But now each interaction carried additional weight. Jed found himself studying her responses, looking for clues in her behavior that might reveal more about her history. When he approached with the morning medications, she greeted him with what seemed like relief, as if his discovery of the tags had lifted some burden she'd carried. Doc Peterson returned that afternoon for a follow-up examination, and Jed made the decision to share what he'd found. The veterinarian examined the tags with professional interest, noting the wear patterns and the careful way they'd been hidden. "Smart kid," Doc said finally. "Someone taught him to think ahead, to leave insurance policies. These tags being here tells us he had time to plan, time to think about what might happen to him and his gear. Can you think of any reason why military horses would end up at civilian auctions?" Doc considered the question carefully. Officially, military animals are either retained for continued service, retired to sanctuaries, or humanely euthanized if their injuries are too severe. They don't get sold at livestock auctions. This mare being here means someone made decisions that weren't by the book. The investigation had begun in earnest, though Jed didn't yet realize how deep it would take him. That night, he dreamed of Tommy for the first time in months, not the nightmares that had plagued him since the notification of death, but something closer to memory. The boy, as he'd been at 19, full of pride and determination, writing letters about a paint mare who'd become his closest companion in a hostile land. When he woke, the mare was standing at the paddock fence, silhouetted against the dawn sky like a sentinel keeping watch. The dog tags sat on his nightstand, catching the early light like promises waiting to be kept. The discovery had transformed everything. What began as an old man's impulsive purchase had become something larger, a quest for truth that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his grandson's death and the circumstances that surrounded it. The coded letter revealed itself 3 days after the discovery of the dog tags, hidden with the same deliberate care that had concealed Tommy's identification. Jed was replacing the mare's blanket with a cleaner one when his fingers detected another irregularity in the fabric, a section where the weave felt different, thicker than the surrounding material. Working by lamplight in his stable that evening, with Miguel holding a flashlight steady, Jed carefully opened the seam. Between 2 layers of wool batting, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, was a piece of paper covered in his grandson's careful handwriting. The letter was water-stained but readable, written in what appeared to be a simple substitution code, numbers mixed with letters in patterns that made no immediate sense. But at the bottom, in plain English, were 3 words that made Jed's heart race: "Safe House Phoenix." "What do you think it means?" Miguel asked, studying the coded message over Jed's shoulder. "I think it means Tommy was smarter than anyone gave him credit for," Jed replied, his voice tight with emotion. "And that he expected someone to find this." The coordinates became clear once Jed applied the basic military code he remembered from his own brief service during Vietnam. Tommy had used a simple cipher, replacing letters with numbers based on their position in the alphabet, but adding a consistent shift that would be obvious to family members who knew his birthday. It was clever enough to stump casual observers, but simple enough for his grandfather to decode. When the translation was complete, they had geographic coordinates for a location in Phoenix, Arizona, along with what appeared to be a contact code, Roadrunner 77. Miguel whistled low. "That boy was planning something, Mr. Cole. This isn't just random information." Jed agreed. The care taken to hide both the dog tags and this coded message suggested Tommy had been operating under the assumption that official channels couldn't be trusted. But it raised more questions than it answered. Why Phoenix? What kind of safe house? And who was operating under the code name Roadrunner? The next morning brought an unwelcome interruption in the form of a phone call from his son, Robert. They'd spoken only sporadically since Tommy's funeral, conversations that were cordial but strained, weighted down by shared grief neither man knew how to express. "Dad, I've been hearing some interesting stories about you." Robert's voice carried the carefully modulated tone he used in legal proceedings. "Harold Whimsy called me, said you bought a broken-down horse at auction last week, paid way too much for it. People are starting to talk." "People have been talking about me for years," Jed replied, settling into his desk chair with the decoded message spread before him. "Nothing new in that. This is different. Harold said you looked like you'd seen a ghost when that horse came up for bid." "Dad, I'm worried about you. Maybe it's time we talked about you moving closer to town, somewhere with people around." The suggestion hit Jed like a physical blow. His son was talking about the kind of move that marked the beginning of the end for men his age, trading independence for supervision, purpose for safety. "I'm fine where I am, Robert. Are you? Because from where I sit, it looks like you're isolating yourself even more than before. This horse thing, it's what, exactly?" Jed's voice carried warning. "It's not healthy, Dad. You can't bring Tommy back by rescuing every stray animal in Montana." The silence that followed was heavy with 3 years of unspoken grief. Robert meant well, but he'd never understood the connection between grandfather and grandson. He'd been too focused on his legal career, too distant from the family ranch, to appreciate the bond that had developed between the old rancher and the boy who'd seen horses as partners rather than property. "I'll call you next week," Jed said finally, ending the conversation before it could deteriorate further. But Robert's words lingered, adding urgency to his growing need to understand what Tommy's messages meant. That afternoon, he made the decision to research the Phoenix coordinates, using the computer skills Miguel's teenage son had patiently taught him over the past year. The address led to an area on the outskirts of Phoenix, in a neighborhood that satellite images showed as modest ranch properties scattered across desert landscape. Nothing immediately suspicious, but nothing that explained why Tommy would have considered it a safe house either. The research process was frustrating for a man accustomed to direct action. Government websites offered only sanitized versions of military operations. News reports from the time of Tommy's deployment mentioned casualties but provided no details about specific units or circumstances. Official records remained classified, protected by layers of bureaucracy designed to keep civilian inquiries at bay. But Miguel proved surprisingly resourceful in ways that didn't involve computers. His network of friends and relatives included several veterans, men who'd served in different conflicts but understood the unofficial channels through which information sometimes flowed. "My cousin's boy served in Afghanistan," Miguel told him over dinner at Maria's kitchen table. "Got back 2 years ago. He said there were rumors about units that got caught up in things that weren't supposed to happen. Operations that went sideways, soldiers who saw things they weren't supposed to see." "What kind of things?" "The kind that make people disappear, even after they're officially dead." The words echoed through Jed's mind as he completed the evening care routine for the mare. She was improving steadily, the medications were working, her appetite had returned, and she'd begun putting more weight on the injured leg. But more than physical healing was taking place. She seemed more alert, more responsive, as if the discovery of Tommy's hidden messages had somehow freed her to trust again. Standing at the paddock fence in the gathering dusk, Jed made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. He was going to Phoenix. He was going to follow Tommy's trail, regardless of where it led or what dangers it might involve. The mare approached the fence, stretching her neck over the top rail to nuzzle his shoulder. In that gesture, he felt something like approval, as if she understood that her long vigil was finally coming to an end. "We're going to find out what happened to him, girl," he whispered against her neck. "Whatever it takes, we're going to find the truth." The coded letter had become more than just evidence. It was a roadmap to answers that official channels would never provide. And somewhere in Phoenix, in a safe house that existed outside normal military protocols, Jed believed he would find the key to understanding why his grandson's horse carried secrets that were supposed to have died with him in a distant desert. The flight to Phoenix marked the first time Jed had left Montana in over 2 years. As the plane lifted off from Bozeman, he watched the familiar landscape of his ranch disappear beneath clouds, feeling like he was abandoning more than just geography. Miguel had promised to care for the mare, but Jed found himself worrying about her recovery, about whether she would understand his absence. The coordinates from Tommy's coded message led to a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Scottsdale, surrounded by desert scrub and the kind of privacy that came from having no close neighbors. Jed rented a car at the airport and drove through the afternoon heat, past strip malls and golf courses that seemed to have sprouted from the desert like mechanical mirages. The address proved to be a adobe-style house with a red tile roof, unremarkable except for the excellent sightlines it offered in all directions. A woman was working in a small garden beside the front door, her movements efficient and alert in the way that suggested military training. When Jed's rental car turned into the gravel driveway, she straightened and watched his approach with the kind of attention that missed nothing. "You must be Mr. Cole," she said as he stepped out of the car. She was Asian American, perhaps 40, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of his appearance. "I'm Sarah Chen. Your grandson left instructions that if anyone ever came looking with the right code words, I should listen to what they had to say." The revelation that Tommy had planned for this possibility hit Jed like another emotional shock. His grandson had been operating on multiple levels, creating contingencies that suggested either exceptional foresight or genuine fear for his safety. "How did you know I was coming?" Jed asked. "I didn't. But I've been watching for someone from Tommy's family for 3 years. He said if anything happened to him, eventually someone would decode his messages and follow the trail here." Sarah gestured toward the house. "He was very specific about what I should tell that person." The interior of the house was Spartan but comfortable, with the kind of functional furniture that could be abandoned quickly if necessary. Maps covered one wall, marked with locations across the southwestern United States. Radio equipment occupied a desk by the window, along with computers that looked more sophisticated than anything Jed had seen outside of military installations. "What is this place?" he asked. "Officially, it doesn't exist. Unofficially, it's a way station for soldiers who need to disappear from official records for their own safety." Sarah poured coffee from a thermal pot, her movements precise and economical. "I'm former military intelligence. Retired early when I started asking the wrong questions about classified operations. Now I help people who got caught up in situations where the official version of events doesn't match reality." She handed him a manila folder that had been waiting on the table, sealed with tape and marked with Tommy's service number. Inside was an envelope addressed to grandfather, in handwriting Jed recognized immediately. The letter inside was longer and more detailed than anything Tommy had been able to send through official channels. Written in the same careful script that had characterized all his correspondence, it told a story that bore no resemblance to the sanitized version Jed had received from the Department of Defense. Tommy's unit hadn't been killed by an improvised explosive device during a routine patrol. They'd stumbled onto an arms-dealing operation that involved both enemy forces and elements within the American command structure. When Tommy and his squad leader tried to report what they'd discovered, they were told to forget what they'd seen and continue their mission as planned. But Tommy had documented everything, photographed evidence, recorded conversations, copied files. He'd hidden the information with Daisy because he trusted his horse more than his own chain of command. When his unit was targeted for elimination to protect the arms-dealing network, Tommy had used his intelligence training to fake his death and escape. "He's alive," Sarah said, watching Jed's face as he processed the information. "Or he was when he left here 18 months ago. He spent over a year recovering from injuries, learning how to live under a new identity." The words hit Jed with physical force. His grandson, the boy he'd mourned for 3 years, whose death had hollowed out his world, was alive. Had been alive all this time, while Jed sat in his empty house, grieving a loss that had never actually occurred. "Where is he now?" "I can't tell you that. It's not safe for him or for you. The people he was running from have long memories and significant resources, but he wanted you to know the truth if you were determined enough to follow his trail this far." Sarah produced another artifact, a torn envelope with a Phoenix address, different from the one where they were meeting. "This is where Tommy stayed while he was recovering. The people who run it are good people, veterans who understand the costs of serving in conflicts that don't follow the rules. They might be able to tell you more." The address led to a neighborhood that had seen better days, where small houses sat behind chain-link fences and the kind of quiet that spoke of people minding their own business. The house Tommy had indicated was distinguished only by its excellent defensive positions and the subtle modifications that suggested military thinking: reinforced doors, strategic placement of windows, clear fields of fire in all directions. The man who answered the door was in his 50s, barrel-chested and bearded, with the kind of alert stillness that marked combat veterans. When Jed explained who he was and showed him Tommy's letter, the man's expression shifted from suspicion to something approaching sympathy. "Your grandson's a hell of a young man," he said, stepping aside to let Jed enter. "Smart, brave, and too honest for his own good. That's what got him in trouble, and it's what kept him alive when trouble found him." The safe house was home to 6 other veterans, men and women who'd found themselves on the wrong side of official narratives for various reasons. They welcomed Jed with the kind of respectful attention reserved for family members of fallen comrades, not realizing that in this case the fallen had simply learned to stay down until it was safe to stand. Over dinner prepared by a former Navy cook who'd lost his clearance for asking inconvenient questions about supply chain corruption, Jed learned more about his grandson's character than years of letters had revealed. Tommy had used his time in hiding to help other veterans navigate the complex process of disappearing from official records while maintaining some connection to the lives they'd left behind. "He talked about you every day," the cook said. "About the ranch, about the horses, about lessons you'd taught him that kept him alive when everything went sideways. He left something for you, in case you ever made it this far." The package contained photographs Tommy had taken during his deployment, images of Daisy in her prime, healthy and alert, carrying her rider through landscapes that looked like the surface of an alien planet. But more than documentation, they were love letters to an animal who'd become his closest companion in a hostile world. The final photograph showed Tommy and Daisy together, both looking directly at the camera with expressions of quiet confidence. On the back, in his careful handwriting, were the words, "For Grandpa, proof that some bonds survive even death. Take care of our girl until I can come home. Love, Tommy." As Jed flew back to Montana that evening, the photographs in his carry-on bag felt like the most precious cargo he'd ever transported. His grandson was alive, somewhere, building a new life under circumstances that remained dangerous. But the 3 years of grief had been transformed into something more complex: relief, mixed with anger, joy tempered by understanding of the ongoing risks. The mare was waiting at the paddock fence when Miguel drove him home from the airport. In the Montana starlight, she seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed. When Jed showed her Tommy's photographs, she nuzzled them gently, as if recognizing faces from a life that seemed both distant and immediate. The Phoenix safe house address had become more than just information. It was proof that Tommy's network of protection extended far beyond what Jed had imagined, and that his grandson's survival depended on secrets that could still get people killed. The encrypted satellite phone revealed itself 2 weeks after Jed's return from Phoenix, hidden with the same deliberate care as Tommy's other messages, but in a location that required deeper investigation. While cleaning Daisy's feed bucket, a task he'd taken over from Miguel as part of his daily routine, Jed noticed that the metal container had an unusual weight distribution. The bottom panel, when examined closely, proved to be a false floor, concealing a waterproof compartment. Inside, wrapped in military-grade protective material, was an old satellite phone with a single number programmed into its memory. The device looked innocuous enough, but Jed recognized military hardware when he saw it. This wasn't standard civilian equipment. It was the kind of communication device used by special operations units when standard channels couldn't be trusted. "Should we turn it on?" Miguel asked, examining the phone with the careful attention of a man who understood that some discoveries carried serious consequences. "Not yet," Jed replied, though every instinct screamed at him to dial the number immediately. If Tommy's alive and this connects to him, using it might put him in danger. But the temptation grew stronger each day. The phone sat in his study like a bridge between his world and his grandson's, offering the possibility of direct contact after 3 years of believing such communication was impossible. The photographs from Phoenix had confirmed Tommy's survival, but they'd also emphasized how precarious his situation remained. The decision was taken out of his hands by his son's unexpected arrival on a Thursday afternoon. Jed was in the paddock with Daisy, who had progressed enough in her recovery to accept a halter and allow herself to be led around the small enclosure, when he heard a familiar voice calling his name. Robert Cole looked every inch the successful Denver attorney, pressed khakis, polo shirt, expensive sunglasses pushed up on his head. But there was something tight around his eyes that spoke of more than professional concern for his father's welfare. "We need to talk, Dad," Robert said without preamble. "Inside, where we can have some privacy." They settled in Jed's study, where the satellite phone sat on the desk beside Tommy's photographs and the coded letters. Robert's eyes immediately fixed on the evidence that his father's investigation had progressed far beyond what anyone in town suspected. "Jesus Christ, Dad. What is all this?" Jed made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. His son deserved to know the truth, regardless of the complications it might create. "It's proof that your son is alive." The silence that followed was complete except for the ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece. Robert's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, desperate hope, before settling on the kind of professional skepticism he used to evaluate witness testimony. "That's impossible. We buried him. I spoke at his funeral." "We buried an empty coffin," Jed said gently. "Tommy faked his death to escape people who wanted to kill him for what he'd witnessed. He's been in hiding for 3 years. The explanation that followed was painful for both men. Jed laid out the evidence systematically: the dog tags, the coded letters, the Phoenix safe house network, the photographs that proved Tommy had survived his supposed death. Robert listened with the kind of focused attention he brought to complex legal cases, asking clarifying questions and poking holes in the narrative where evidence seemed thin. "Even if this is true," Robert said finally, "why didn't he contact us? Why let us grieve for 3 years if he was alive?" "Because contacting us would have put us in danger. The people he was hiding from had resources inside the military, inside government agencies. They would have used us to get to him." Robert studied the satellite phone with new understanding. "And this connects to him?" "I think so. But using it might compromise his safety, or it might be the only way to warn him that his security has been compromised." Robert's legal training had kicked in, analyzing risks and benefits with professional detachment. "Dad, if you've been investigating this for weeks, asking questions, traveling to Phoenix, other people might know what you're doing." The possibility had occurred to Jed, but hearing it spoken aloud gave it new urgency. His investigation hadn't been particularly subtle. He'd used his real name, his credit cards, his own vehicle. If Tommy's enemies were still watching for signs of family members getting too close to the truth, Jed's activities would have raised significant red flags. As if summoned by their conversation, the satellite phone began to ring. Both men stared at the device as it vibrated against the desk surface, its electronic trill cutting through the afternoon silence like an alarm. The caller ID showed only a series of numbers that meant nothing to either of them, but the timing seemed too coincidental to ignore. "Answer it," Robert said, his voice tight with tension. Jed activated the phone and lifted it to his ear. "Hello? Grandpa." The voice was older, more cautious than the boy he remembered, but unmistakably Tommy's. "I was hoping you'd never find this phone, but since you did, we need to talk quickly. You're in danger." The sound of his grandson's voice after 3 years of silence hit Jed with the force of a physical blow. His vision blurred and his hands shook as he gripped the phone, trying to find words adequate to the moment. "Tommy. Dear God, boy, we thought you were dead. I know, I'm sorry. But listen to me carefully, you need to get away from the ranch. Tonight, The people I've been hiding from know about your investigation. They're coming." Robert leaned closer, straining to hear both sides of the conversation. His face had gone pale as the reality of his son's survival hit him with full force. "How much danger?" Jed asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Enough that they'll eliminate anyone who gets too close to the truth. Pack light, take only what you absolutely need, and get somewhere public where there are witnesses. I'll contact you again when it's safe." "Tommy, wait." But the line had already gone dead. The satellite phone's screen showed no indication that a call had taken place, as if the conversation had been a hallucination brought on by grief and desperate hope. Father and son looked at each other across the study desk, both understanding that their world had just shifted in fundamental ways. Tommy was alive, but his survival came with a price that now extended to his family. The investigation that had begun with an old man's impulsive horse purchase had escalated into something that threatened all their lives. "We should call the police," Robert said, falling back on legal training when emotional processing became too complex. "And tell them what? That we've been contacted by a grandson who's been officially dead for 3 years? That we're being threatened by people whose existence we can't prove?" Robert's silence acknowledged the impossibility of their situation. They were caught between a truth that no one would believe and a danger they couldn't fully understand. Outside, Daisy whinnied softly, a sound that seemed to carry across the evening air with unusual urgency. The mare had been restless all day, as if sensing approaching changes that human senses couldn't detect. Now, as darkness gathered around the ranch house, her call sounded almost like a warning. The encrypted phone had become more than just a communication device. It was proof that Tommy's world of hidden dangers had finally intersected with theirs, and that the investigation Jed had begun in grief was about to become a fight for survival. The threatening letter arrived with the morning mail, delivered by a postal carrier who had no idea he was carrying a message that would shatter any illusion of safety the Cole family might have maintained. Miguel found it first, mixed in with ranch supply catalogs and utility bills, distinguished only by the absence of a return address and the quality of paper that suggested serious intent. Inside the unmarked envelope was a single sheet of heavy stock paper with a message composed of words cut from newspapers and magazines, like something from a kidnapping movie. But the threat it conveyed was utterly real. "Stop looking, or join your grandson in his grave. This is your only warning." Attached to the letter with a paperclip was a photograph that made Jed's blood run cold. It showed him at the Phoenix safe house, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from a significant distance. The image captured him walking to his rental car after his meeting with the veterans, unaware that he was being surveilled by professionals with resources that extended far beyond what he'd imagined. "They've been watching you since Phoenix," Robert said, studying the photograph with the analytical eye of someone accustomed to evaluating evidence. "This level of surveillance requires serious funding and organization." Miguel looked up from feeding Daisy, his weathered face creased with worry. "Mr. Cole, maybe we should listen to them. If these people killed soldiers to protect their secrets—" "They didn't kill Tommy," Jed interrupted, though the full implications of their situation were beginning to register. "But they tried to, and they'll try again if they think we're getting too close to exposing what they did." The sound of vehicles approaching on the ranch road interrupted their discussion. 3 black SUVs with government plates were making their way up the long driveway, moving with the kind of purposeful coordination that left no doubt about their intentions. "Sarah Chen," Jed said, recognizing the lead vehicle even at a distance. The former military intelligence officer had warned him that his investigation might attract unwanted attention, but seeing her arrive with an escort suggested the situation had escalated beyond anything he'd anticipated. The woman who stepped out of the lead vehicle was the same Sarah Chen he'd met in Phoenix, but now she carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone operating in an official capacity. The men who emerged from the other vehicles were clearly federal agents, dark suits, earpieces, the kind of alert professionalism that marked serious law enforcement. "Mr. Cole," Sarah said, approaching with what looked like genuine concern. "We need to talk, all of you, right now." They gathered in the ranch house living room, a space that suddenly felt inadequate for the magnitude of what was being discussed. Sarah's escort remained outside, maintaining a perimeter that suggested they expected trouble from multiple directions. "The safe house network I showed you in Phoenix," Sarah began without preamble, "it's not just a group of concerned veterans. It's part of a federal witness protection program for military personnel who've been compromised by criminal activity within their own units. I work for the Justice Department, and your grandson is a key witness in a prosecution that's been under development for 3 years. The revelation hit Jed like a physical blow. Tommy wasn't just hiding, he was preparing to testify against people with the power and motivation to eliminate anyone who threatened their operations. The arms-dealing network he'd uncovered involved not just enemy forces, but American military contractors, government officials, and private security companies with connections that reached into the highest levels of federal agencies. "Why didn't you tell me this in Phoenix?" Robert demanded, his legal instincts immediately suspicious of Sarah's delayed disclosure. "Because your father wasn't supposed to get this far." Tommy's messages were designed to provide comfort to his family, not launch an investigation that would compromise an ongoing federal case. But since Mr. Cole proved more resourceful than anyone anticipated, we need to bring him inside the protection protocols. Sarah produced a current photograph of Tommy, taken within the past month according to the timestamp. He looked older, more serious, but unmistakably alive and healthy. He was standing beside a different horse, a bay gelding, in what appeared to be a training facility somewhere in the southwest. "He's been helping us build cases against the criminal network," Sarah explained. "His testimony, combined with the evidence he collected, has already resulted in 17 arrests across 4 states. But the leadership of the organization is still at large, and they're willing to kill anyone who threatens their operations." The photograph revealed another crucial detail that transformed everything Jed thought he understood about his grandson's situation. Tommy wasn't just surviving in hiding, he was thriving, rebuilding his life while contributing to the pursuit of justice for the crimes he'd witnessed. "I want to see him," Jed said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had built a ranching empire. "That's not possible," Sarah replied. "Contact between protected witnesses and family members is strictly controlled to prevent security breaches that could compromise ongoing investigations." "Then why are you here?" "Because the criminal organization has identified you as a threat. Your investigation in Phoenix triggered surveillance protocols that brought you to their attention. They believe you know more than you actually do, which makes you a target for elimination." Robert stood up abruptly, pacing to the window to study the federal agents positioned around their property. "So what are our options?" "Witness protection for the whole family. That's one possibility. But there's another alternative that would allow you to maintain your lives here while helping us complete the prosecution that will finally make it safe for Tommy to come home." The alternative Sarah proposed was both simple and terrifying. They could serve as bait, continuing to act as if Jed's investigation was progressing toward dangerous discoveries, while federal agents used the Cole family as a focal point for drawing out the criminal leadership. The plan required them to maintain normal routines while wearing surveillance devices and following security protocols designed to keep them alive when the inevitable attack came. "You're asking us to paint targets on our backs," Robert said flatly. "I'm offering you a chance to help bring your son home permanently instead of hiding from shadows for the rest of your lives." The decision wasn't easy, but it was inevitable. Tommy had risked everything to expose crimes that demanded justice, and his family couldn't do less than support that effort when it mattered most. Jed agreed to the operation with the understanding that failure would likely result in the deaths of everyone he cared about. That evening, as federal agents installed surveillance equipment throughout the ranch house and positioned backup teams at strategic locations across the property, Jed sat with Daisy in her paddock. The mare had become more than just a link to his grandson. She was a symbol of the loyalty and courage that had kept Tommy alive through 3 years of impossible circumstances. "He's coming home, girl," he whispered against her neck. "One way or another, this is going to end with him coming home." The threatening letter had become the catalyst for a federal operation that would determine whether Tommy's sacrifice led to justice or whether the criminal network he'd exposed would succeed in silencing the final witnesses to silencing their crimes. As darkness settled over the Lazy Sea Ranch, Jed understood that the next few days would test everything he believed about family, courage, and the price of doing what was right. The photograph of his grandson training horses in witness protection had revealed a truth more complex than simple survival. Tommy had found a way to build meaning from the ashes of his former life, and now his family had the opportunity to help him complete the mission that had cost him everything he'd once taken for granted. Outside his window, federal agents maintained their vigil, while Daisy stood sentinel in her paddock, both of them guardians of secrets that were finally approaching the light of justice. The federal operation transformed the Lazy Sea Ranch into something that looked peaceful from a distance, but hummed with lethal preparation beneath the surface. Sarah Chen's team worked with military precision, installing surveillance equipment that turned every building into an observation post and every vehicle into a potential command center. They operated under the assumption that the criminal network would move quickly once they realized the Cole family posed a genuine threat to their operations. "The beauty of using your ranch as the operational base," Sarah explained to Jed and Robert during a briefing session in the barn, "is that it provides natural reasons for people to come and go. Feed deliveries, veterinary visits, normal ranch business, all perfect cover for moving personnel and equipment into position." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Jed would continue his normal routines, caring for Daisy and maintaining the appearance of an old rancher whose investigation had reached a dead end. Robert would extend his stay, ostensibly helping his father manage ranch business while actually serving as additional bait. Meanwhile, federal agents would monitor every approach to the property, waiting for the criminal organization to make the kind of decisive move that would expose their leadership structure. "How long before they come?" Robert asked, adjusting to the reality that his legal practice would have to wait while he helped draw murderers toward his family. "Not long," Sarah replied. "Our intelligence suggests they're already positioning assets in the area. The leadership has decided that eliminating the Cole family is worth the exposure risk, which tells us they believe you've discovered something that could destroy their entire operation." What they'd actually discovered was far more limited. Tommy was alive. He'd been in witness protection for 3 years, and he was helping federal prosecutors build cases against military contractors involved in illegal arms sales. But the criminals didn't know the scope of the family's knowledge, and their paranoia would drive them to take risks that careful criminals normally avoided. The first sign of approaching danger came from an unexpected source. Daisy had been restless for 2 days, pacing her paddock and whinnying softly whenever vehicles approached the ranch house. On Wednesday evening, she began displaying behavior that Doc Peterson, when consulted by secure phone, described as classic prey animal responses to approaching predators. "She's sensing something we can't," Sarah told her surveillance team. "Military horses are trained to detect threats at longer range than normal animals. If she's this agitated, they're already closer than we thought." The realization that their enemies were using Daisy as an early warning system would have been amusing under different circumstances. The mare who'd carried Tommy's secrets across an ocean and 3 years of hiding was now serving as a security asset in the operation to bring her rider home safely. Miguel had been briefed on the essential details of the federal operation, though Sarah's team kept the full scope of their preparation classified. His family had been moved to a safe location in Billings, ostensibly for a vacation, but actually to remove them from potential danger. Miguel himself had volunteered to remain at the ranch, arguing that his sudden departure would alert the criminals that security measures were in place. "These people," Miguel said during a quiet moment as he and Jed fed Daisy her evening medications, "they killed soldiers to protect their secrets. They won't hesitate to kill us too." "I know," Jed replied, stroking the mare's neck as she nuzzled his shoulder, "but Tommy's been fighting them alone for 3 years. It's time his family stood with him." The emotional weight of the approaching confrontation settled over the ranch like a gathering storm. Jed found himself thinking about Margaret, about how proud she would have been of Tommy's courage and how worried she would have been about the dangers they were all facing. She'd always been the heart of the family, the one who kept them connected to what mattered most. Now, as they prepared to risk everything for justice, he felt her presence in the evening wind and in Daisy's gentle responses to his care. Robert spent the waiting hours on the phone with his law firm, arranging coverage for cases that might extend indefinitely if the operation went badly. But Jed could see in his son's face a transformation that had been building since the moment they'd learned Tommy was alive. The successful attorney was reconnecting with the father he'd buried under professional ambition, and the man emerging from that process was someone Jed recognized from years past, someone who understood that family obligations transcended personal convenience. "I should have been here more," Robert said during dinner on Thursday night, the meal prepared by federal agents who'd been positioned as temporary ranch hands. "After Mom died, after Tommy deployed, I should have spent more time at the ranch instead of hiding in my practice." "You're here now," Jed replied. "That's what matters." But they both understood that here might not last much longer. Sarah's intelligence suggested the criminal organization had moved operational teams into Montana, probably using legitimate business cover to position assets within striking distance of the ranch. The federal response had been equally aggressive. Surveillance drones monitored approaches from all directions, sniper teams occupied positions on neighboring properties, and rapid response units waited at staging areas throughout the county. The scale of the operation reflected the significance of what Tommy's testimony could accomplish. The criminal network he'd uncovered wasn't just selling weapons to enemy forces, they were systematically looting military supplies, falsifying inventory reports, and eliminating anyone who discovered the scope of their activities. The prosecution Sarah's team was building could result in hundreds of arrests and recover millions of dollars in stolen equipment. But first, they had to survive the next 48 hours. Friday morning brought a development that changed the entire operational timeline. A delivery truck arrived at the ranch gates, claiming to have feed supplies that Jed hadn't ordered. The driver's credentials checked out, the paperwork looked legitimate, but Sarah's background checks revealed connections to shell companies that had previously been linked to the criminal organization. "They're testing our responses," Sarah told Jed and Robert during an emergency briefing. "Seeing how we react to unexpected visitors, whether we've got federal protection, how professional our security measures are. This means they're probably planning to move tonight." The realization that their enemies were already probing the ranch's defenses transformed the abstract danger into immediate threat. Federal agents shifted from surveillance mode to active protection, positioning themselves for combat while maintaining the illusion that nothing had changed in the ranch's daily routines. Jed continued caring for Daisy, but now each trip to her paddock felt like it might be his last. The mare seemed to understand the approaching danger, staying close to the fence when he was near, her ears constantly moving to track sounds beyond normal human hearing. She'd become more than just a link to Tommy. She was a partner in the operation to bring him home, contributing senses and instincts that technology couldn't replicate. As the sun set on Friday evening, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and purple, Jed stood at his bedroom window and watched federal agents take their final positions. Sarah had insisted that he and Robert remain in the main house during the anticipated attack, protected by agents positioned throughout the building. But Jed's thoughts were with Daisy, alone in her paddock, while dangerous men approached with intentions that had already cost too many lives. The satellite phone Tommy had hidden in her feed bucket sat on Jed's nightstand, its encrypted connection representing the only direct link to a grandson who was probably preparing for his own confrontation with the same criminal organization. Somewhere in the federal witness protection system, Tommy was waiting for news that would determine whether he could finally come home or whether his family would join him in a life defined by hiding from enemies with long memories and unlimited resources. The clock in the hallway chimed 10 times, marking the beginning of what Sarah's intelligence suggested would be the longest night of their lives. Outside, the ranch looked peaceful under the starlight, but Jed could feel the tension building like pressure before a thunderstorm. Soon, very soon, 3 years of hiding and investigation and careful preparation would explode into violence that would determine whether justice prevailed or whether the criminal network succeeded in silencing the final witnesses to their crimes. In her paddock, Daisy stood alert and watchful, her dark eyes reflecting starlight as she maintained her vigil over secrets that had traveled from foreign battlefields to a Montana ranch, carrying the hopes of a family that refused to accept that some truths were too dangerous to pursue. The attack came at 2:30 in the morning, just as Sarah's intelligence had predicted. Jed woke to the sound of Daisy's urgent whinnying, a sound that cut through the ranch house silence like an air raid siren. Through his bedroom window, he could see the mare pacing frantically in her paddock, her military training triggering responses to threats still invisible to human senses. "They're here!" Sarah's voice crackled through the radio system that connected every room in the house. Multiple vehicles approaching from the north and east, everyone to positions. Federal agents moved through the darkened house with practiced efficiency, taking cover behind reinforced positions they'd prepared during the past week. Robert joined Jed in the upstairs hallway, both men wearing body armor that felt alien against their civilian clothes. Through the windows, they could see muzzle flashes in the distance as the first exchange of gunfire erupted between the attacking forces and the federal perimeter teams. "How many?" Robert asked, his legal training providing no framework for processing a firefight on his family's property. "At least 12 vehicles that we can identify," Sarah replied from her command position downstairs. "Professional-level assault team, military weapons, coordinated movement patterns. These aren't just criminal enforcers, they're experienced operators." The revelation that the criminal organization had deployed what amounted to a private army spoke to both their desperation and their resources. They were willing to risk a major confrontation with federal law enforcement rather than allow Tommy's testimony to proceed to trial. Outside, Daisy's calls had attracted the attention of the other ranch horses, and their combined distress created a cacophony that added surreal background to the gunfight developing around the property. But her behavior served a crucial tactical purpose. The mare's agitation had provided federal agents with several minutes of advance warning, allowing them to identify approach routes and establish defensive positions before the actual assault began. The first real test came when explosive charges detonated against the ranch house's reinforced front door. The blast shook the entire structure, sending dust cascading from the ceiling and triggering car alarms throughout the valley. But the door held, and the attackers who rushed through the smoke encountered federal agents who'd been waiting in prepared positions. "This is Agent Chen," Sarah's voice broadcast over both internal communications and the emergency frequencies monitored by local law enforcement. "Federal agents under fire at the Lazy Sea Ranch. Request immediate backup from all available units." The firefight that followed was brief but intense. Professional criminals armed with military weapons faced federal agents who'd prepared for exactly this scenario, and the outcome was determined more by positioning and preparation than by raw firepower. The attackers had expected to find an isolated ranch family, not a federal operation that had been planning their reception for days. But the real surprise came when the satellite phone in Jed's pocket began ringing. "Grandpa." Tommy's voice was tight with urgency when Jed answered. "Federal communications are being jammed, but this frequency is still clear. I need you to get to Daisy's paddock. Right now." "Tommy, there's a firefight going on outside." "I know. I'm coordinating federal response from the backup command center, but there's something in Daisy's saddle that Sarah's team doesn't know about. Something that could end this tonight." The request seemed impossible under the circumstances, but Tommy's voice carried the kind of authority that came from 3 years of survival in situations where mistakes meant death. Against all tactical sense, Jed found himself moving toward the stairs. "Where are you going?" Robert demanded, grabbing his father's arm. "To get something that might save our lives," Jed replied, pulling free and heading for the back door that led to the paddocks. The route to Daisy's enclosure required crossing 50 yards of open ground that was currently being swept by searchlights from the attacking vehicles. Federal agents provided covering fire, but the exposure was terrifying for a man whose combat experience was limited to movies and old war stories. Daisy was waiting at the paddock gate, her military training evident in the way she'd positioned herself for quick movement despite her injured leg. When Jed reached her, she immediately moved toward the corner where her saddle hung on a fence post, as if she understood exactly what he needed to find. Working by feel in the darkness, Jed's hands found what Tommy had directed him toward a hidden compartment in the saddle's pommel that contained something he'd never seen before. It was a small electronic device, about the size of a cell phone but heavier, with military markings that suggested sophisticated technology. Tommy's voice crackled through the satellite phone again. "It's a GPS tracker that's been recording the locations of everyone who's had contact with the criminal organization for the past 3 years. Every meeting, every arms transfer, every payoff, all documented with precise coordinates and timestamps." The revelation that Daisy had been carrying the electronic equivalent of a smoking gun for 3 years was staggering. Tommy had turned his horse into a mobile surveillance platform, collecting evidence that would implicate not just the foot soldiers, but the entire leadership structure of the criminal network. As Jed ran back toward the house, federal agents coordinating from their backup command center were already using the tracker's data to identify and intercept the criminal organization's leadership team. The firefight at the ranch was just the visible portion of a much larger operation that was simultaneously rolling up criminal cells across 4 states. The GPS tracker's data transformed the firefight from a defensive action into the final phase of a coordinated federal operation that spanned multiple states. As Jed reached the safety of the ranch house, Sarah's voice was already coordinating simultaneous raids on locations the device had identified across the Southwest. "Phoenix, Las Vegas, Albuquerque, and Denver teams are moving now," she reported through her headset while providing covering fire for Jed's return. "We've got warrants being executed on 17 locations based on the tracker data. This is bigger than we imagined." The criminal organization's assault on the ranch had been intended as a decisive strike to eliminate the Cole family before Tommy's testimony could proceed. Instead, it had triggered the very federal response they'd spent 3 years trying to avoid. Their desperation to silence the family had led them to expose the full scope of their operations at the worst possible moment. But the immediate danger hadn't passed. The attackers outside were professional soldiers who'd committed to an operation that couldn't be abandoned without fatal consequences. Even as their leadership was being arrested in distant cities, the assault team at the ranch continued their attack with the kind of lethal persistence that marked men with nothing left to lose. "Dad, get down!" Robert's shout came just as sniper fire shattered the living room window where Jed had been standing moments before. The glass explosion sent both men diving for cover behind the reinforced furniture that federal agents had positioned throughout the house. The battle reached its climax when the attackers attempted to breach the house using explosive charges that shook the century-old structure to its foundations. Federal agents responded with coordinated fire from multiple positions, but the criminals had brought enough firepower to level a small building, and the ranch house's defenses were being systematically destroyed. It was Daisy who provided the unexpected tactical advantage that turned the tide. The mare had broken free from her paddock during the height of the firefight, her injured leg apparently forgotten in the face of immediate danger. Instead of fleeing like any sensible animal would have done, she moved toward the attacking forces with the kind of deliberate purpose that spoke to her military training. "What the hell is that horse doing?" one of the federal agents called out as Daisy limped directly into the line of fire between the attackers and the ranch house. The answer became clear when her presence triggered a response that no human defender could have anticipated. The lead attacker, a man whose face was partially obscured by tactical gear, lowered his weapon when he saw the distinctive paint markings that identified her as a military horse. "Stand down," his voice carried across the battlefield with unmistakable authority. "That's a U.S. cavalry mount. We don't fire on military assets." The moment of hesitation was all the federal agents needed. Professional soldiers, even criminal ones, operated under codes of conduct that included respect for military animals who'd served in combat zones. That split second of recognition gave Sarah's team the opening they needed to end the firefight with surgical precision. The arrest of the assault team's leadership occurred with remarkable speed once their command structure recognized that continuing the attack would accomplish nothing beyond ensuring their own deaths. Tommy's GPS tracker had already provided federal prosecutors with enough evidence to destroy their organization, and the ranch assault had been recorded by surveillance systems that would document every war crime they'd committed on American soil. As dawn broke over the Lazy Sea Ranch, the scope of the night's success became apparent. Federal operations across 4 states had resulted in 43 arrests, the seizure of millions of dollars in stolen military equipment, and the recovery of evidence that would prosecute corruption cases reaching into the highest levels of defense contracting. But the most significant moment came when a helicopter landed in the ranch's north pasture, carrying a passenger who'd been waiting 3 years for this particular sunrise. Tommy Cole stepped out of the aircraft wearing civilian clothes that couldn't disguise the bearing of a soldier who'd survived impossible circumstances. He looked older, more serious, marked by experiences that had transformed a 19-year-old boy into a man who understood the true cost of courage. But when he saw his family waiting beside the ranch house, the smile that transformed his face was pure Tommy the grandson, who'd once written letters about a paint mare named Daisy. The reunion was everything 3 years of grief and hope had promised. Grandfather, father, and grandson stood together in the Montana morning light, surrounded by federal agents and the debris of a battle that had finally brought justice to those who'd thought they were above the law. Daisy approached slowly, her injured leg reminding everyone that some wounds took time to heal completely. But when she reached Tommy, the greeting between horse and rider spoke to bonds that transcended time, distance, and the kind of trauma that broke weaker spirits. "I told you I'd come back for you, girl," Tommy whispered against her neck, his voice carrying the kind of emotion that marked endings and new beginnings in equal measure. The saddle that had carried her secrets across an ocean and 3 years of separation had served its final purpose, delivering justice to those who'd thought they could silence truth through violence. 6 months later, the Lazy Sea Ranch looked much as it had before federal agents had turned it into a fortress, but the silence that had once haunted its halls had been replaced by something Jed had thought was lost forever, the sound of family. Tommy had chosen to remain in Montana rather than return to military service, using his skills to help other veterans transition back to civilian life while staying close to the grandfather who'd risked everything to bring him home. The witness protection program had officially ended with the successful prosecution of the criminal network, but the bonds forged during those dangerous months had created new purposes for everyone involved. The ranch house that had echoed with loneliness now buzzed with activity. Tommy had moved into the guest wing, but his presence filled the entire structure in ways that reminded Jed of the years when Margaret's laughter had made their home a gathering place for friends and neighbors. Robert visited every weekend, his law practice restructured to allow more time for family obligations he'd neglected too long. Daisy had recovered fully from her injuries, though she moved with the careful dignity of a mare who'd earned the right to take her time. Her paddock had been expanded into a proper pasture, and she'd been joined by 3 other retired military horses that Tommy had helped relocate through the veteran support network he'd established. The animals grazed peacefully in the morning sun, their scars hidden by healthy coats that spoke to care provided by people who understood the value of service and sacrifice. The federal prosecution had exceeded even Sarah Chen's optimistic projections. The evidence Tommy had collected, combined with the GPS tracker data and testimony from other witnesses who'd emerged once the criminal network was dismantled, had resulted in convictions that would keep the organization's leadership in federal prison for the rest of their lives. The recovered military equipment was valued at over $50 million, but the real victory was the restoration of faith in systems designed to protect those who served their country. Miguel and his family had returned to the ranch with stories of their vacation that fooled no one but maintained the fiction that their absence had been voluntary. Maria's cooking once again filled the kitchen with aromas that reminded everyone that home was about more than just shelter, and their children had adopted Tommy as the older brother they'd never had but always wanted. The transformation most visible to the community was in Jed himself. The grief-stricken rancher who'd made headlines by buying a broken horse at auction had become something approaching a local legend, the grandfather who'd taken on federal criminals to save his family. But those who knew him well understood that the real change was simpler and more profound. He'd found his way back to hope. The morning ritual that had sustained him through months of investigation and danger had evolved into something richer. Instead of caring for Daisy alone, he now shared the task with Tommy, both of them taking pleasure in routines that had once been markers of time passing toward an uncertain future. The mare responded to both men with the kind of trust that came from shared experience and mutual respect. "She's gained weight," Doc Peterson observed during one of his regular visits, running experienced hands along Daisy's flanks. "Military horses often struggle with civilian life, but she's adapted better than most." "She had reasons to stay strong," Tommy replied, scratching behind her ears in the way that made her lean into his touch. She was carrying messages that needed to reach the right people. The artifact that had started it all, the family portrait that sat on Jed's mantelpiece, had been joined by a new photograph taken on Tommy's first morning home. 4 generations of Cole men now looked out from the silver frame. Jed, Robert, Tommy, and a surprise addition that no one had expected when the dangerous months began. Tommy's engagement to Sarah Chen had been announced quietly, without fanfare, in the way that people who'd survived genuine danger approached new happiness. She'd resigned from federal service to help Tommy establish the Veteran Support Network, her skills in intelligence analysis proving invaluable in identifying and assisting soldiers who'd been betrayed by the systems they'd served. The wedding was planned for October, when the Montana landscape would provide the kind of backdrop that reminded everyone why some places were worth fighting to protect. Sarah had requested only one special arrangement for the ceremony that Daisy serve as part of the processional, carrying rings that had been blessed by survivors of conflicts spanning 3 generations. "It seems right," she'd explained to Jed during one of their planning sessions. "She carried the messages that brought us all together. She should be part of making it official." The ranch that had once felt too large for one old man now seemed perfectly sized for a growing family. Tommy and Sarah were house hunting in town, but planned to maintain the guest wing as a retreat where they could help Jed manage the expanding veteran support operation. Robert had begun discussing the possibility of relocating his practice to Montana, finally ready to prioritize family over career advancement in ways that would have made his mother proud. On quiet evenings, when the work was finished and the mountains caught the last light of day, Jed often found himself standing at Daisy's pasture gate, watching her graze alongside her companions. The mare who'd carried secrets across an ocean and 3 years of separation had become something larger than anyone had imagined, a symbol of loyalty that transcended the boundaries between human and animal, between service and family, between what was lost and what could still be found. The new family photograph caught afternoon light through the study window, illuminating faces that carried the wisdom earned through genuine hardship and the joy that came from understanding that some bonds could survive even death itself. Tommy's letters from deployment had promised that he'd return to the ranch someday, and though the journey had taken paths no one could have predicted, that promise had finally been kept. In her pasture, Daisy lifted her head from the grass and looked toward the house, her dark eyes reflecting contentment earned through service that would never be forgotten. The secrets she'd carried had brought justice to those who'd thought they were above the law, but more importantly, they'd brought home a family that understood the true meaning of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds that connect all hearts, brave enough to love beyond the reach of fear.